This week, you've been learning more about socialization. In previous chapters, you learned that norms are the unspoken rules that govern and direct our behavior. Norms can be further subdivided into mores and folkways. Mores are norms that help us to distinguish between right and wrong. They're widely observed and have great moral significance. Mores apply everywhere all the time, and they're a part of social standards for proper and moral conduct. When people break social mores by, for example, committing murder or incest, they inspire widespread condemnation. Folkways, meanwhile, help us to distinguish between what is considered right and what is considered rude. They are guidelines for routine behavior and do not inspire the same level of moral condemnation as when mores are broken. Swearing loudly or picking your nose in public are examples of violations of folkways in Canada. Different cultures have particular social norms for an incredibly diverse array of social situations and interactions. We learn our culture and social norms through the lifelong process of socialization. In part, our socialization is directed by our society's system of social control and the sanctions it relies upon. Socialization is a lifelong process that's integrated into our everyday lives. In many ways, socialization helps make us who we are. Socialization also begins immediately upon birth. One of the clearest examples of this is the way that we are socialized into gender roles. Babies are generally wrapped in a blanket immediately upon birth. But those blankets are color-coded according to gender. Boys get a blue blanket, and girls get a pink blanket. Studies have also shown that people will treat a baby differently depending on the color of blanket they're wrapped in. In other words, right from the moment you're born, you're treated differently depending on what people assume is your gender. So, from the time we're born, we begin to be socialized into learning the norms and expectations of our culture. The immediacy upon which socialization begins is one of the reasons that the web of biological and interpersonal influences on human behavior and development has been so difficult to untangle. However, the extreme cultural differences that are evident around the world have challenged the idea that human behavior and development results strictly from biological imperatives. How, it's asked, can human behavior be strictly the result of biological imperatives when even social norms that are considered universal vary cross-culturally and historically? Cultural universals refer to traits that are a part of every known culture in the world. Some cultural universals include the use of humor, funeral rites, social stratification, taboos against incest, and family units. However, although these traits exist in every known culture, they nonetheless vary widely. Although humor is found in all known cultures, what's considered humorous in one culture might be seen as offensive in another. And although all known cultures have some form of funeral rituals, such rites vary widely, historically and cross-culturally. Likewise, social norms concerning the family are widely variant. In your textbook reading this week, you learned that the family is one of 4 important agents of socialization. In North America, it's common for people to assume that the nuclear family, comprising a heterosexual couple and their children, is natural and the result of biological imperatives to reproduce. These assumptions have been evident in the work of sociologists as well. For example, the influential structural functionalist scholar Talcott Parsons defined the heterosexual nuclear family as ideal for child-rearing and essential to the biological and social reproduction of a society. Although once highly influential, Parsons' work has been widely criticized and largely dismissed by many sociologists, in no small part due to its ethnocentric bias. Despite commonplace assumptions that the nuclear family is normal or has biological foundations, the nuclear family form is actually a relatively recent and highly culturally specific phenomenon. Historically and cross-culturally, highly diverse family forms have provided supportive environments for the socialization of children. Some examples of different family forms profoundly challenge North American and Western European assumptions about the family. For example, who we are related to may seem the natural and obvious result of biology, but notions of blood ties, or who actually constitutes our family, are highly variable cross-culturally. On the Trobriand Islands, a child is considered to be the blood relative of its mother and her siblings, but is not considered to be a blood relative of her or his biological father. In contrast, the Lakur people of Burma do not consider a mother to be the blood relative of her own children. As you can imagine, ideas about who you are or are not related to also have implications for each culture's incest taboo. Since children of one father and different mothers are not considered to be related among the Trobrianders, sexual relations among those children is not considered incest. The same is true of children who share the same mother and different fathers among the Lakur. Examples such as these undermine the assumption that there is a natural family form. Despite this variety, however, it remains clear that the family is tremendously influential. As the site of primary socialization, families help children to internalize culture and develop a social identity. The families we live in confer a social position, including as related to class, ethnic or racial background, religion, and so on. Your textbook provides a more detailed exploration of the relationship between the family and socialization in the Canadian context. The other three agents of socialization explored in your text include schooling, peers, and media and technology. Schools continue the socialization process from the family in terms of gender, race, and class. In schools, trained teachers develop and pass on specialized knowledge that will help later adults in the workforce and society. Education systems are responsible for socializing large groups of young people in particular values and skills. In Canada, almost all young people spend most of their first 18 years in school. Socialization occurs in school in terms of educating us about such things as math, science, languages, and social sciences. But we're also taught many more things than just what's on the official curriculum. Schools are also an important venue for the transmission of cultural norms and values. This is sometimes described as the hidden curriculum. However, just as families do not always provide supportive or effective socialization, schools can also fail in this regard. A devastating Canadian example of this is residential schools, which were set up across Canada with the express goal of undoing the socialization that Aboriginal children experienced in their families and assimilate them into white European Canadian society. According to the Deputy Minister of the Indian Department, Duncan Campbell Scott, the intention of the schools was to, quote, kill the Indian in the child, end quote. In a very real sense, residential schools can be considered total institutions. Children were kept away from their families and communities for long stretches of time and were banned from speaking their own languages. Residential schools played a significant role in destabilizing First Nations linguistic and cultural heritages and exposed children to physical and sexual abuse, as well as death and disease. Through neglect and malnutrition, mortality rates in some residential schools approached 50%. The unsanitary nature of the buildings they were made to live in was a major cause of the high death rates, conditions and death rates that school officials and politicians were well aware of. The last residential school in Canada only closed in 1996. The implications of residential schools dramatically demonstrate that agents of socialization are not always effective or positive. Families have the potential to be sites of violence and neglect. Residential schools were total institutions in Canada that devastated Aboriginal children, their families, and their communities. But when residential schools were at their peak, the vast majority of Canadians assumed that they were to the benefit of Aboriginal children. Similarly, many people have assumed that the nuclear family is natural, inevitable, and even ideal. By adopting a sociological perspective on these issues, we can begin to critically engage with these underlying assumptions and their impact on our worldviews and social practices.